Okay guys, welcome to Unit 3 of my reviewing my AP Psychology notes. So Unit 3 is all about sensation and perception. Sensation is the process by which our sensory receptors and nervous system receive and represent stimulus energies from our environment. And perception is the process of organizing and interpreting sensory information, enabling us to recognize meaningful objects and events. So sensation is the process of touching something and the sensation being taken from your fingers to your brain. Perception is what happens in your brain where your brain is like, oh, the thing that I'm touching is soft. And it also helps for a lot of other things too. Bottom-up processing is analysis that begins with the sensory receptors and works up to the brain's integration of sensory information, versus top-down processing, which is information processing guided by higher-level mental processes, as when we construct perceptions drawing on our experience and expectations. Selective attention is the focusing of conscious awareness on a particular stimulus. For example, when you're on your phone in class and you don't hear the teacher, even though technically you probably could hear her, you don't hear what she's saying, you don't register it because your attention is focused on your phone. The cocktail party effect is the ability to focus on a single speaker in a noisy environment. Inattentional blindness is failing to see a visible object when our attention is directed elsewhere, and change blindness is failing to notice changes in the environment. So, for the example for change blindness, we watched this video where there were some basketball players, and you were told to watch the basketball players and see who won, and then at the end, the video told you that a polar bear had walked through them, one person in a polar bear costume, but most of people wouldn't see it the first time. But when you watch it the second time, knowing that the polar bear is there and looking for it, then you see that polar bear. All of our senses receive sensory stimulation, transform it into neural impulses, and deliver the neural information to our brains. Transduction is the conversion of one form of energy into another. In sensation, the transforming of stimulus energies such as sights, sounds, and smells into neural impulses our brain can interpret. Psychophysics is the study of the relationship between the physical characteristics of the stimuli, such as their intensity, and our psychological experience of them. The absolute threshold is the minimum stimulation needed to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. For instance, some people can detect sounds at specific pitches that others cannot. And signal detection theory is predicting how and when we detect the presence of a faint stimuli or signal amid background stimulation such as noise. It assumes there are no single absolute thresholds and that detection depends partly on a person's experience, expectations, motivation, and alertness. For instance, a ambulance siren. Subliminal, below one's absolute threshold for conscious awareness. Fun fact, experiments have proved that subliminal messaging doesn't actually work and is not a thing, so you can't actually be subliminally messaged into something. It's pretty obvious if you're messaged into something. Like, commercials are not subliminal. Priming, the activation, often unconsciously, of certain associations, thus predisposing one's perception, memory, or response. For instance, there's an example, but it's not actually helpful. But, for instance, if you associate Bible reading with punishment because your parents make you read a chapter of the Bible when you do something wrong, then that's priming you to have a negative association with reading the Bible. That's just something off the top of my head. The difference threshold, which is specifically for just barely noticeable difference, is the minimum difference between two stimuli required for detection 50% of the time. We experience it as a just noticeable difference. Weber's law is the principle that to be perceived as different, two stimuli must differ by a constant minimum percentage, rather than a constant amount. Sensory adaptation is a diminished sensitivity as consequence of constant stimulation. For instance, people that live by busy streets are less likely to hear all of the noise. Where were we? The benefit of sensory adaptation is that we have freedom to focus on information changes in our environment without being distracted by background chatter. A perceptual set is a mutual predisposition to perceive one thing and not another. For instance, once you see the Loch Ness Monster in an image, you can't really unsee it even if the image is actually a log. You don't know that. Extrasensory perception, or ESP, is the controversial claim that perception can occur apart from sensory input, which includes telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. Parapsychology is the study of paranormal psychology, including ESP and psychokinesis. Vision. The wavelength determines the distance from the peak of one light or sound wave and the peak of the next. Hue is the dimension of color that is determined by the wavelength of light, or color names. So blue is a hue. Amplitude determines the brightness of colors and loudness of sounds. And intensity is the amount of energy a light or sound wave, which we perceive as brightness or loudness, is determined by the wave's amplitude. The eye. Parts of the eye are the cornea, which protects the eye and blends light to focus. The pupil is the adjustable opening in the center of the eye through which light enters. The iris is a ring of muscle tissue that forms the colored portion of the eye around the pupil and controls the size of the pupil opening. The lens is the transparent structure behind the pupil that changes the shape to help focus images on the retina. Is that one page or 2 pages? 2 pages. The retina is the light-sensitive inner surface of the eye, containing the receptor rods and cones, plus layers of neurons that begin the processing of visual information. Accommodation is the process by which the eye's lens changes shape to focus near or far objects on the retina. Rods are retinal receptors that detect black, white, and gray, necessary for peripheral and twilight vision. Cones are the retinal receptor cells that are concentrated near the center of the retina and that function in daylight or in well-lit conditions. The cones detect fine detail and give rise to color sensations. Optic nerves are formed of bipolar cells and ganglion cells. Bipolar cells activate ganglion cells when light makes a chemical change. Ganglion cells, their axons twine together to form the optic nerve. The optic nerve is the nerve that carries neural impulses from the eye to the brain. A blind spot is the point which the optic nerve leaves the optic nerve leaves the eyes, creating a blind spot because no receptor cells are located there. The fovea is the central focal point in the retina around which the eye's cones cluster. The optic nerve carries information to the occipital lobe. Feature detectors, which I have Hubel and Wiesel, I believe are the scientists that discovered it, or named it, are the nerve cells in the brain that respond to specific features of the stimulus, such as shape, angle, or movement. So feature detectors, if you're having trouble with feature detectors, you can't recognize people's faces. Parallel processing is the processing of many aspects of a problem simultaneously. The brain's natural mode of information processing for many functions, including vision. It contrasts with the step-by-step processing of computers and conscious problem-solving. For example, you recognize a person by their face. So parallel processing is the process of recognizing people by their face. The feature detectors are what allow you to do that. The young Helmholtz trichromatic theory is the theory that the retina contains 3 different color receptors, which, when stimulated in combination, can produce the reception of any color. The red, green, and blue are the 3 colors our eyes are sensitive to. According to the Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory, color blindness is caused by lack of red-green color sensing cones. However, we have another theory about how the eye senses color. It's called the opponent process theory by somebody named Herring, that opposing retinal processes enable color vision. So red is opposing green, blue opposes yellow, and white opposes black. After images are what happen when you look at one color and then look at white. The opposite of that color appears. Opposite being like across from it on the color wheel. And let me just turn the page on my other thing so I can see where we are now. Okay, now we're talking about visual organization and interpretation. So, the gestalt is an organized whole. It emphasizes gestalt is a school of thought that believes strongly in an organized whole. It emphasizes our tendency to integrate pieces of information into meaningful wholes. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So, the figure ground is the organization of the visual field into objects that stand out from their surroundings, objects being figures and their surroundings being the background, which is why it's called figure ground. Grouping is the perceptual tendency to organize stimuli into coherent groups. Proximity, we group nearby figures together. Continuity, we perceive smooth, continuous patterns rather than discontinuous ones. And closure, we fill in gaps to create a complete object. Depth perception is the ability to see objects in 3 dimensions, although the images that strike the retina are 2-dimensional. It allows us to judge distance. The visual cliff is a laboratory device for testing depth perception in infants and young animals. It is what we've learned from that is that you are born with depth perception. It's not something that people learn. Binocular depth cues are depth cues such as retinal disparity that depends on the use of 2 eyes. Retinal disparity is a binocular depth cue. By comparing images from the retinas in 2 eyes, the brain computes distance. The greater the disparity, the closer the object. I'm confused. Interesting. Oh, wait, never mind. That makes sense. Sorry. Brain fart. Alright. And then we have monocular depth cues, which are available to either eye alone, such as interposition and linear perspective. Relative height, which is perceiving the lower part of a figure ground illustration as closer, and the higher as farther away. When you look at a picture that has ground and sky, you automatically assume the sky is farther away than the ground, if the ground is at the bottom of the picture. Relative size is if we assume 2 objects are similar in size, the one that is farther away will look smaller. Interposition. If one object partially blocks our view of another, we perceive it as closer. Relative motion. When we move, fixed objects appear to move. And like when you're in a car and the fence is going by. Linear perspective. The sharper the angle of parallel lines converging in the distance, the greater the perceived distance. Light and shadow produce a sense of depth with the assumption that light comes from above. Okay, and then these are just things, they're not specifically monocular or binocular. The phi phenomenon is an illusion of movement created when 2 or more adjacent lights blink on and off in quick succession. Perceptual constancy is perceiving objects as unchanging, even as illumination and retinal images change. For example, a soccer ball is the same when it's standing still as it is when it's moving. Color constancy. Perceiving familiar objects as sharing consistent color, even if changing illumination alters the wavelengths reflected by the object. Perceptual adaptation. In vision, the ability to adjust an artificially displaced or even inverted visual field. For example, a new pair of glasses or a new smell. Hearing. Audition. The sense or act of hearing. Amplitude. Determines the loudness of sound waves. Frequency determines the pitch, high or low, of sound waves. Decibel, what sound waves are measured in. Ear. The outer ear is the eardrum. It vibrates, sending vibrations to the middle ear, which is the 3 bones in the middle ear. They are called the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, and they pick up the vibrations from the eardrum and transmit them to the inner ear, which consists of the cochlea. The cochlea is a membrane which vibrates, jostling the fluid that fills the tube, which bends the hair, triggering adjacent nerve cells, sending neural messages to the brain. So many pages. So a summary of hearing is that vibrations cause the cochlea's membrane to shake. This causes ripples in the ear fluid, bending the hairs lining its surface. Hair cells convert the messages into neurons that are then sent by the axons to the thalamus, then onto the auditory cortex and the temporal lobe. Sensorineural hearing loss is caused by damage to the cochlea's receptor cells or to the auditory nerves. And conduction hearing loss is caused by damage to the mechanical system that conducts sound waves to the cochlea. The cochlear implant converts sound into electrical signals and stimulates auditory nerves through electrodes in the cochlea. The number of activated hair cells helps us interpret the loudness of a sound. Place theory links the pitch we hear with the place where the cochlea's membrane is stimulated. It is used to perceive high pitches. Frequency theory, the rate of nerve impulses traveling up the auditory nerve matches the frequency of a tone, and that's used to interpret low pitches. And the volley principle. By firing in rapid succession, they can achieve a combined frequency above 1,000 waves per second, which is used in the intermediate range. For perception in the intermediate range. And we locate the source of sound by the intensity of the sound and the time of hearing the sound. Okay, touch. The 4 distinct skin senses that make up touch are pressure, warmth, cold, and pain. You need to feel pain so you don't get hurt. Pain is a combination of your sense of touch and your brain. The gate control theory for pain is that the spinal cord contains a neurological gate that blocks pain signals or allows them to pass on to the brain. The gate is opened by the act of pain signals traveling up small nerve fibers and is closed by activity in larger fibers or by information coming from the brain. Phantom limb sensations. When the brain misinterprets the spontaneous central nervous system activity that occurs in the absence of normal sensory input. For example, an example of psychological influences of pain: attention to pain, expectations, learning based on experience. Examples of sociocultural influences of pain: cultural expectations, empathy for others' pain, and presence of others. Taste. There are 4 basic tastes: sweet, salty, bitter, and sour. But we now have a 5th new taste, like we always had it, but we just didn't have it classified, which is called umami. And umami is kind of savory, and it is, what I have written here is proteins to grow and repair tissue. That's what we taste, but proteins to grow and repair tissue usually come from protein, which is meat, and cheese, which are savory. Taste is a chemical sense. Chemicals touch taste buds that send flavor messages to the brain. I'm just going to see how many pages we have left and if it's worth stopping now, because yeah, that's okay. Alrighty, so this is the end of this episode. I hope it was informative, and please come back for more.